Drafting Archetypes is brought to you by Grey Viking Games. Check them out with our affiliate code link in the description.
Hi everyone, this is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and we are on to Crimson Vow, and the first archetype I'm going to be discussing is Blue-Black. I've chosen to discuss Blue-Black because, for whatever reason, I've drafted blue a lot so far. It's the color I've drafted most, and I've had a few Blue-Black decks and a few notable games against Blue-Black opponents, and so it was an archetype I felt relatively comfortable discussing, given how early we are in the format. Now, obviously, I've only been playing with the set for a few days. It's only been out for a few days. So take anything I say with a grain of salt here. But I do think, this is speaking with some experience, if not full authority. So one thing I can say with absolute confidence is there are only 9 exploit creatures in the set. There is 1 uncommon, 1 rare, and 2 commons in each blue and black. And then there is 1 blue-black uncommon, which is enough exploit stuff that you'll generally see some of it in a draft, but not so much that you can be really picky about it if you're looking for it. And it's a small enough amount that if 2 people in a table are looking for it, one or both of them might not see very much of it and might not have enough for it to be like a primary thing that their deck is doing. So while blue-black sometimes or often focuses on exploit, I think that if you're drafting blue-black, you need to be prepared for the possibility that someone else at the table might be looking for those cards, and you might have to pivot into some different blue-black strategy. I think this is a color combination that lends itself pretty well to having a few different approaches in terms of just like fundamental game plan and what their curve looks like and what kinds of cards they want. I think that there's the like all synergy like exploit version. I think there's kind of like a skies-y, tempo-y type deck. And then I think there's also like a removal card draw control type deck. And I think those are all kind of like different archetypes within blue-black that are going to have some appreciably different valuations of cards and priorities and stuff. So I'm going to try to speak at least a little bit to each of those. But as far as like when you're thinking about what you're supposed to be doing with this color combination, you want to know that all of these and probably other options are on the table. And so you want to try to be figuring out which of these directions you're going for, or, at least at some point in the draft, not necessarily 2 picks in or whatever, be like, oh, I'm this kind of deck. Because you do want some amount of flexibility, and you want to, early in the draft, take prioritize cards that are going to work well in multiple of those approaches, or, proportionate to how likely you are to end up wanting to go in that direction. And then the further you get through the draft, the more you should be solidifying what you expect your game plan is and taking cards to, in addition to just like generally filling out your curve and stuff, also to support and supplement that strategy that you've selected. Let's see. The key cards that are going to tell you how to choose, like which of these lanes you want to be in. The best commons, like Bleed Dry, is probably the best common in blue-black. Obviously doesn't give you a lot of direction. It's just a versatile removal spell. You're going to play it no matter what your deck is doing, and it's going to work about it the same. Whereas the best uncommons, there are a few different categories that the best uncommons in this color combination fit into. So there's like the premium removal spells, like Parasitic Grasp, I think it's called. The deal 3, gain 3, cost less if it targets a human. And then there's Hero's Downfall, 1 and 2 black, kill a creature or planeswalker. Those are very much like Bleed Dry. They're just going to be good no matter what. But a lot of the other best blue and black cards are the uncommon exploit creatures. So that's the black 3/2 Death Touch Scorpion that exploits to make a player to sign in blood. And then Biolume Egg, which is 2 and a blue, 0/4 ETB Scry 2. When you sacrifice it, it comes back at the end of the turn as a 4/4 that can sacrifice 2 islands to become unblockable. That card is really, really strong if you have exploit stuff, because it lets you, exploit for free, and then, it lets you, it basically gives you a free, it gives you 2 scry up front, can block, then you exploit it, and you get this, better than 3 mana worth of creature for it. So that's kind of like the strongest thing to sacrifice to your exploit creatures. So if you start the draft, basically, if you start the draft with Biolume Egg, you know that you're really going to be looking for exploit creatures. And the fact that you're looking for exploit creatures means you also want to look for other things to sacrifice to those exploit creatures for when you don't draw your Biolume Egg. Whereas if you start with a premium removal spell, then you're going to be a lot more flexible. You might end up taking some exploit stuff and some enablers if it's convenient, but you'd be more likely to take something like a Cruel Witness, the blue 2 3/3 flyer with some perks if you cast non-creature spells, over Doom Dissenter, the 1 and a black 1/1 that gives you a 2/2 when it dies. Whereas if you are going down the exploit path, you're likely going to be more interested in the Doom Dissenter than the Cruel Witness. Well, I think Biolume Egg and the blue-black 2/2 exploit scab guy, whatever that thing's called, are the 2 cards that most strongly push you into exploit as a game plan. Whereas if you take a different exploit creature, there it can be more of an incidental thing. Like if you have a Diver Scab, the 3/5 for 5 that exploits to put a creature on top or bottom of its owner's library, that's something where if you're playing blue-black, it's probably pretty easy to, maybe I have the name wrong, whatever that scab is. Maybe it's going to be pretty easy to have something to sacrifice without working really hard to have a lot of exploit stuff. You can just have 1 exploit creature and a few fodder type creatures. Whereas if you have the Skull Scab or the Biolume Egg, you're going to want a density of exploit stuff to really take advantage of what's going on there, which means that you're going to be prioritizing all the exploit stuff that you find, prioritizing all the fodder you find, and really going for that. Whereas if you have just a premium exploit creature, then it's just okay, well, keep an eye out for some Lantern Bearers, some Doom Dissenters, but for the most part, draft more just straight up. And then obviously, while you're drafting straight up, if you see a Biolume Egg or a Skull Scab, that might send you back into that exploit path that I'm talking about. Similarly, if you end up tabling a bunch of late exploit creatures at the end of pack 1, now it's okay, well, I guess this is just open and I have these things and I'm going to want to take advantage of them, so now I should start prioritizing the fodder. In general, I think you want to prioritize the fodder over the common exploit creatures. So this is kind of an enablers over payoffs kind of situation where Doom Dissenter and Lantern Bearer are just pretty solid cards in blue-black, where the common exploit creatures aren't going to be very good if you don't have things that you kind of actively want to sacrifice to them. Their payoffs are just not high enough. That is particularly true for Mind Leech School, which ranks as, currently according to the early stats, the most overplayed common in blue-black in terms of how often people play it relative to how often it wins. I think that's because, it has the words that tell you that it goes in this deck, but at the end of the day, when you jump through the hoops, it's just not even really worth it. You curve Lantern Bearer, that's a thing that's really good to sacrifice, into Mind Leech School, and you're okay, cool, I can sack my 1-drop for value. And then it's on turn 2, I'm wait, do I even actually want to sacrifice this Lantern Bearer? Do I really care about them exiling a card of their choice on turn 2, or would I rather just have my 1/1 flyer? So that really low ceiling on Mind Leech School makes it not something you want to prioritize unless you're really looking for more ways to sacrifice stuff, which is basically only going to come up if you have Biolume Egg or if you're in some kind of bloody betrayal spot where you're really looking for sack outlets. Yeah, so Mind Leech Ghoul is definitely not something you want to prioritize. Then the 2 blue exploit commons, the 3/2 that exploits to basically like cast Opt, I guess, or the 3/3 that exploits to get a thing back from your graveyard, Repository Scab and Stitched Assistant, are like good if you have enablers, but they're like, a little bit below rate if you play them and you don't exploit. Basically, I think that the exploit deck should be uncommon driven, particularly for the cards with exploit. And ideally, you're going to exploit the creatures you're sacrificing. Ideally, want to be the egg and the 1/2 ghoul that ETB mills 3, and then when it dies, you can exile it to get a creature back. Those are the like most premium things to exploit. But if I have to use like commons for fodder or uncommons for fodder, like if I have a common and an uncommon in the equation, I'd rather have common fodder, uncommon exploit creature than common exploit creature, uncommon fodder, probably. Although, I mean, it's whatever. I mean, the uncommons are a lot better than the commons in both cases. As for the common fodder, the good common fodder is Lantern Bearer and Doom Dissenter. Those should be prioritized appreciably ahead of the weaker common fodder, which is Persistent Specimen and Wretched Throng. Persistent Specimen, I would say, has an asterisk that is, if you have a ton of exploit, then Specimen becomes really important. But if you don't have like a lot of exploit, then you would prefer not to play it because it's pretty bad on its own. And then Wretched Throng is like, if you have 3 Wretched Throngs in your deck, I would rather have 3 Doom Dissenters. Like, the fact that I can put more mana in to get more total bodies out of it isn't better than being capped at getting 2 bodies and not needing to invest mana for the second one. Which means that because when you want to go into Wretched Throngs, you have to fight people to make sure that you get enough of them. It's not something that I really want to that's not a fight that I want to get into because the payoff is so low. So I'd rather just look for Dissenters and Lantern Bearers and generally stay out of the Wretched Throng battle. Yeah, you basically want your 2-drops, your 2 mana commons to be Bearers and Dissenters as much as possible. And I think that's true even if you're just dabbling in exploit. Those are still the 2 best commons, 1 and 2 mana commons, I think. I think your common 2 mana options in Blue-Black are not very good. I have occasionally found myself playing Steelclad Spirit basically just as a wall, with very few ways to ever attack with it, just because I want to be able to block early. Ragged Recluse is another kind of mediocre. So Steelclad Spirit is the 1 and a blue 3/3 that can only attack if you played an enchantment, and Ragged Recluse is the 2/1 when you discard a card, flips into a 3/3 at the end of your turn, and the 3/3 drains for 1 and it attacks. Those are kind of filler, desperation 2-drop type level cards. The other approach that I've had when I'm not doing the exploit thing that I've had experience with myself is kind of the Cruel Witness deck, where you're just kind of playing skies. Lantern Bearer and Cruel Witness are your premium commons, and then you just presumably get some of the higher rarity evasive creatures. There are a number of solid uncommons in that space, and you can even play you have a couple of 3 mana options that aren't great. Courier Bat and the 2/3 Spirit that can't block non-flyers. The Courier Bat is the Windrake that if you gain life can get something back from your graveyard. It's pretty hard to gain life in Blue-Black. Your best options are Desperate Farmer and Gluttonous Guest. If you have a reasonable number of those, then Bat can become an actual priority. Desperate Farmer and Gluttonous Guest, I think, are both independently worth talking about. Desperate Farmer is the best common 3-drop in Blue-Black, I think, in general, ahead of Stitched Assistant. It just, lifelink is obviously great. We come back to this discussion literally every limited format where every card that gains life overperforms because no one ever properly adjusts for just internalizing, gaining life is just always great in limited. And then Desperate Farmer is just really good to have around when you exploit anything, and then it becomes this like really good creature. That's the 2/2 lifelink on the front that when another creature of yours dies, flips into a 4/3 lifelink. And then Gluttonous Guest is one of the winners of the most underplayed relative to how much it wins cards in blue-black, which isn't to say that it wins exceptionally often, just that it's played very little, and the defensive body with, giving you a bit of blood and potential life gain for Courier Bat is, an acceptable card to have. And then Diregraph Scavenger is just worth noting as this is a very good card just in general. It's in kind of the vampire spawn space where basically any black deck wants it. Blue-black, I think, uses it pretty well. It's not a part of the synergy stuff. So if you're really focusing on synergy stuff, it's, you might prioritize other things over it. And then there's also an issue where you have an abundance of good 4-drops. You have Diregraph Scavenger, Cruel Witness, Bleed Dry as like absolute premium options. And then you also have like Repository Scab and Scattered Thoughts. And then further down from that, there's also Bloodcrazed Socialite, which is a really strong card, but not really great in blue-black specifically. So you end up with this glut at 4 that leads to me sometimes needing to like deprioritize Diregraph Scavenger a little bit. But it's a really good card because blue-black is good at winning in the air, good at winning in long games, and Diregraph Scavenger is really good at blocking on the ground, buying you some time, making you not get killed. So just a good fit, even if it's an awkward spot on curve. I think the biggest problem with blue-black at common really is just that so many of its good cards cost 3 and 4 mana. I mentioned that Gluttonous Guest was one of the most underplayed relative to how successful cards in blue-black. The other one is Grisly Ritual, the 6 mana removal spell. Again, not that that card is exceptional, but playable, and it's not played very much. So don't feel bad if you end up in a spot where, like, okay, I should play this. Like, it is a card that wins more than Scattered Thoughts, for example, which is the 4-mana instant. Look at 4 cards, draw 2 of them, mill 2 of them. Let's see, other stuff to touch on. Undying Malice and Alchemist's Retrieval are both commons that have the perk of letting you re-trigger exploit stuff. And then they also just have like normal functionality outside of that. Both of them perform pretty well in blue-black. I think you should generally keep an eye out for them. And then another set of commons to talk about, counterspells. Syncopate and Siphon Essence at common both, I would say, overperform relative to what I would expect most people to anticipate. I think they are the second and third best performing blue commons after Lantern Bearer. I think that leads into a quick, I think most people know this, but worth acknowledging, just general statement about the format, which is it's a bomb-heavy format. The games are very likely to be decided by rares and premium uncommons. The gap in power level between the best commons and the average commons is not very big relative to the gap between any commons and the rares. Yeah, I think a lot of people discuss that fact and formats where this is true as an indictment of the format, and I don't necessarily see it that way. I think that there are some interesting things about this dynamic. I personally enjoy playing against busted rares because I feel really good when I beat them. And I also like that opening strong rares in draft gives you a direction and makes you draft a deck that you might otherwise not. And also, the early stats for this format are showing that this is the most balanced in terms of win rates for each color that we've seen in a long time. And I think that's because when games are determined by commons, the colors with the best commons just keep winning. Whereas when games are determined by rares, the color of a rare that someone happened to cast wins, and there are good rares in all the colors. And so the impact of rares helps to kind of obscure, basically it just like dwarfs the significance of any imbalance that exists in commons. And you might say, well, that doesn't change anything. Like, it means that it's harder for us to know which color is better than another color, but there are still better colors and worse colors. But the reason that it matters is when you're playing a lot of drafts, especially on Arena, you don't play against the same decks over and over because people are going to be playing whatever colors of bombs they opened rather than just like, drafting red black treasure over and over or drafting blue black zombies over and over. And so you just get more varied experience in terms of what you're playing against, both in terms of just playing against more different color combinations and also having more games where the dynamic of the game is just different because it's warped by this one powerful card. Like Stensia Uprising, the red 2 enchantment that makes a human every turn and threatens to do 7 damage, is like, a strong card, but not an unbeatable card. But it's a card that's going to have a warping impact on a game. You're going to have to play differently because your opponent has that card than you would if they had something else. And these powerful cards, for me, as someone who plays a lot and as someone who doesn't care very much about losing any game in particular, help to give me a more varied play experience, which I like. If you're someone who is prone to like tilting if you lose to a really powerful card, like there are certainly reasons to personally prefer formats that are more driven by commons. But when I say that this is a rare driven or like Prince format or whatever, for me that's not an indictment of the format. It's just acknowledging the fact of the matter. Given that the fact of the matter is there are really strong rares that are going to determine a lot of games, counterspells are a way to deal with them. Just as removal is better in this format than it often is, counterspells are better in this format than it often is. So where, in a lot of formats, I'll say, yeah, I just want like the good common creatures over the good common removal spells. I don't really care if my deck has removal or not. Here, well, the good common creatures don't do anything. Like, they're fine, but they lose to the good uncommon and rare creatures. So I'm not going to prioritize a good common creature because it's nothing special. Whatever it is, it's nothing special. There are just better creatures around. Whereas like Bleed Dry is completely effective and like, works. It will do what I need as a removal spell, and I'm not going to get as much removal as I want, so I'm going to take it. Which, is kind of like what I was saying about the uncommons driving both parts of the like exploit fodder package, where, I will prioritize like premium exploit and fodder creatures over common removal, because the uncommons are so much better in that role than the commons. It's all about value over replacement, and common creatures just don't offer good value over replacement in this format. Just full stop. So, yeah, prioritize hard removal, prioritize counterspells, and so that applies to, Syncopate, Siphon Essence, and Grisly Ritual in particular in blue-black. I guess, the everything else I was saying about, the creatures also just really applies here, right? Like, I talked about how there's like the synergy stuff that you can look for, and it's good if you get a bunch of it, especially if it's powered at uncommon. And then there are some, common creatures that are better than the other common creatures, particularly like Desperate Farmer and Diregraph Scavenger. But there are so many uncommons that like are much better than those, where the gap is just much bigger. The difference between a Desperate Farmer and like a Stitch Assistant or, even a Gluttonous Guest isn't as big as the gap between a Desperate Farmer and the Scorpion or the Egg or something. And this is kind of true all the way down. Like, preparing for this podcast, I made a skeleton of like what blue-black looks like if you just take its 16 best performing commons. And then that left a list of all the other commons that aren't in that top 16. And I just noted them in order based on their win rate. And I could go down pretty far on the commons that weren't in the top 16 and still have cards I'm perfectly happy to play, right? Like, so Scattered Thoughts, for example, is outside of, is the top common that's outside of that deck. Gift of Fangs isn't in that deck. Persistent Specimen, Courier Bat, Bloodcrazed Socialite, all these cards that are reasonable. Mindleech Ghoul, Dreadlight Monstrosity, Binding Geist, and Skywarp Scab are both lower than everything else I've mentioned. And I've played a bunch of Binding Geists, and like I've played Skywarp Scab, and these cards are like 10 cards down the list of cards that you theoretically shouldn't even need to put in your deck. But the delta in quality between basically any two commons in this format relative to the gap between, commons and higher rarity cards is just really, really small, which can, from a certain frame of reference, make it seem like, okay, it just doesn't matter what I take. I should just like scan the pack for a bomb. If there isn't one, just take a random card of my color and it doesn't matter. But the other way of looking at it, which is more like how I look at it as someone who's, obviously into really, minor optimization, is, one of these choices is better than the other for where I am. And because all of the cards are comparably powerful in a vacuum, it's more likely that the correct choice is going to vary more depending on my exact needs and the exact context of the deck that I have. And so, again, this gets back to replayability. It's going to be more fun for me to keep drafting this format because it's not like, oh, I always take the A common over the B common over the C common. It's all the commons are about as good, and I'm just looking for any little synergies I can find or any, minor variations in what my curve is, or like, do I need something to block flyers? Do I need something to end the game? Do I need something to like hold the ground early? Do I need like a removal spell for small creatures so that I don't get run over? And all those questions can really make me take like almost any common over almost any other common. And that's only true because the commons are all so comparable in power level. Yeah, that's all, hopefully there's something useful in there, or you find my just kind of like, theory level discussion of like what's going on in the construction of this format interesting. Let me see some other stuff I haven't covered. Blood Fountain is another card that is pretty far down the list of cards that don't perform especially well, but I think is noteworthy in this deck. When you're exploiting, it's very easy to put cards in your graveyard, creature cards. And so Blood Fountain is it's very easy to be able to count on Blood Fountain being able to put cards in your hand. The fact that you can count on Blood Fountain being able to put cards in your hand doesn't necessarily mean that you want to put it in your deck, because it's still comparable to Scattered Thoughts, right? They're both use a card and 4 mana to put 2 cards that you've had some selection about into your hand. And this might be a format where spending 4 mana to put 2 cards in your hand is just not a great rate. If you have the kind of deck that's going to engineer games that can afford to do that, because you're playing Desperate Farmers and Gluttonous Guests and Diregraph Scavengers that help the game go longer, and you have removal spells to answer your opponent's bombs, like Bleed Dry and Grizzly Ritual. If you have some premium creatures that are going to die, then putting Blood Fountain in your deck so that you can threaten your opponent with them again might be a good choice for you. Even though, again, Blood Fountain is something like the 24th best blue or black common or something. So I mentioned the top uncommons are like these premium removal spells and the exploit stuff. Another uncommon that I was happy to see performs quite well is Witness the Future, which is shuffle 4 cards in the graveyard into a library, look at 4 cards, put 1 in your hand, which is hypothetically, just like from the text box, one of my favorite cards ever, because I just love doing that thing, just like looping my deck and casting my good cards over and over. And I was afraid that the format would be too aggressive for that, right? Like, this is a format where like I know that Scattered Thoughts is pretty hard to use because it's pretty clunky. So I was surprised to see that in a pretty small sample size, Witness the Future has like a 58% win rate, which is above most of the like non-bleed dry type commons in this color combination. That was encouraging in terms of telling me like, all right, I'm allowed to do it. I have permission to try to draft the like blue-black Witness the Future control deck where I just, have like card draw and removal and Witness the Future and try to kill my opponent's stuff forever. And I'm looking forward to doing that. I haven't done it because I thought that it was probably something I'd get punished for. So I'm looking forward to exploring that more. So that's something that I can't, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. That's one of those things that it would be cool if I knew before recording this podcast, but I don't yet. So I think if I were to keep going, I'd probably talk in circles. So instead of doing that, let's get some chat-directed babbling. So anything you feel like I haven't answered or touched on or whatever yet, hit me up with questions in chat, regardless of whether you've already said something about it or not. If I haven't addressed it, put it back in chat while I'm letting people think about things they want to ask and type them up. I do want to thank my newest patron, Matthias or Matthias, probably Matthias. Thank you very much for your support. And anyone else who's interested in, who appreciates my work or has learned from this podcast and is interested in, giving back, supporting patreon.com/drafting archetypes would be a great place to look, see if any of the benefits appeal to you. We offer things like access to all of my draft logs on 17 lands and my notes for each of these episodes. I do have notes for this episode. I did forget to post them before recording this, but I will be posting them after. So if you are listening to the podcast as opposed to listening to this live, you can look them up to follow along, I would hope you've already done that if that's something you like to do. And to anyone who's watching this live, there are some more details, about the skeleton and stuff that I mentioned that you can check out there later after I post this. Anyway, let's get to some questions. Since the format is so bomb heavy, how does splashing off-color bombs fit into blue-black? In my experience, splashing has not felt very easy to do in this format. I think green can do it pretty easily, and other decks, it's very hard. And I don't even necessarily think that it's a great idea to do it in green. Theoretically, blood helps, but in practice, I think it helps very little. I'm interested in the idea of a Grixis deck. I guess this is a thing I forgot to talk about. I'm interested in the idea of a Grixis exploit deck that uses Bloody Betrayal, but my first draft ended up kind of drifting into that space without properly preparing and had really bad mana. I think if you set out to do it, it might be reasonable, but for the most part, I found mana really tough in this format. It's not that it's low on number of cards that help you splash. The issue is that it has a bunch of 3-mana cards that let you splash, and you just can't put a bunch of 3-mana cards to help you splash in the same deck. You want, some jack-lanterns and some whatever, 3-mana fixing, but you want, a curve of anything that you're playing a lot of, and you can't have a curve of fixing. Unless you're green, where you can at least have mulch and the taxidermist. But if you're blue-black, you're Evolving Wilds is great. If you have Evolving Wilds and some Scattered Thoughts and you're confident that you're going to be able to play a long game, maybe you make some blood, maybe you have some really good bomb to splash, sure. But for the most part, I am currently approaching this format, despite how important bombs and removal are, as a 2-color format. I want to be drafting in such a way that I can shift into a color to take advantage of a really, really strong bomb that I see, but not in such a greedy way that I just try to play every color to play every bomb. I think the mana just works much better for 2-color decks, and it's better to potentially give up a bomb to have a consistent deck. Next up, you've said in the past that decks with strong bombs favor big games. Long games, really, I think. Some of the best improvement when drawn commons and uncommons, however, seem to be fairly aggressive, like Blood Tithe Harvester and Lantern Bearer. Is this going to exert downward pressure on the win rate of bomb-centric decks? So the best way to beat a bomb is to win the game before your opponent draws or casts it. So if you don't have better bombs than your opponent, you will be very well positioned if you can just kill them. So when you are looking at uncommons that win games, it makes sense that the uncommons that win games sometimes do it by killing your opponent. Blood Tithe Harvester, the red-black 3/2 that makes a blood and then can sacrifice to give something -X, where X is twice the amount of blood you have, is the best uncommon right now by like 4%. And the reason is that it's both removal and good pressure and also value. And like this is a format that both wants you to answer bombs by killing your opponent and answer bombs by killing the bombs, and Blood Tithe Harvester does both of those things. Like the fact that everyone should know your deck won't be able to hang in the late game unless you have bombs, and you don't always have bombs. Therefore, by default, when you're drafting, if you haven't seen a bomb, you have to be aggressive. Yeah, that's going to lead to a fast format. And I think that's a great way to get me back into the previous statement about splashing. I think that the threat of people going over the top of you with these crazy bombs means that the people who don't have them have to try to kill you, which means that you can't get super greedy with your fixing, and you can't, get super greedy with your card advantage and play Scattered Thoughts, even though the fact that everyone wants to play all their removal means that the format should drift more toward attrition. This gets into only so much removal exists. And whether it's correct to take the removal first pick or whether it's correct to take the removal fifth pick doesn't change how much total removal there is very much. It's a negligible change. There's just, X good removal spells, they're going to be in someone's deck. You would like them to be in your deck, but as far as how often you're playing against it, that's just a function of how much of it is in the packs. And maybe everyone would like to have 2 more removal spells than they do, but because they don't have them, the format doesn't actually end up being this attrition grind fest. Now in Sealed, that can change a bit. In Sealed, people get to prioritize their removal relative to their good threats differently depending on what's going on. And so this Sealed format might be particularly attrition based. But draft is going to be about as much attrition as, the amount of removal in the packs happens to allow. That means, it means that, yes, I think that this is and will continue to be and likely only become more of an aggressive format. Next up, touching on counter spells like Siphon Essence and Syncopate, how many would you run in draft deck before not picking anymore? When and how much to play counter spells in Limited is always a pretty interesting and layered question. I just 7-0'd right before recording this podcast with a blue-white deck that had a very low curve, a lot of cheap flying creatures that I won by being very aggressive. I did have 2 good rares. They contributed, but for the most part, I was winning because I had a low curve of aggressive creatures that had evasion, and I was supporting it with multiple counter spells. So I could get under my opponent, and then I could leave mana up to counter their things. And if you have a curve that lets you do that, that's kind of the best spot for counter spells. It's analogous to if you've followed Standard over the past few years, the mono blue deck that Autumn Burchett won the Pro Tour with, that was, cheap flyers and counter spells. That's I guess, broadly, when the question is how much should I play counter spells? If you think about which constructed decks want counter spells, structurally the same thing is true in Limited. So the decks that want counter spells are when you go way under your opponent, you can afford to leave mana up because you're already ahead on board. And so if you trade mana with them when they try to play their spell, you keep your advantage. Whereas if you fall behind, your opponent has some creatures, your counter spells don't catch you up. And so while you can trade to stop them from playing further ahead, you're still just sitting there getting beat up, which isn't going to work unless you can afford to get beat up because you have some kind of strong catch-up mechanic in your deck that's going to cost more mana, but it's going to like get you back where you need to be, which could be just, like essence or scattered thoughts and removal spells. So you could have, just like a draft deck that has like a bunch of abrades and scattered thoughts and counter spells and doesn't have early pressure, but has cheap removal and card advantage. And that's a way to play a lot of removal or a lot of counter spells. And then there's the low curve way to play a lot of counter spells. If you're playing like blue-green, just like a bunch of fatties that cost 3, 4, and 5 mana, that deck can't afford to play very many counter spells because it's going to be really hard for you to leave out mana for them. It might be okay to have like one of them, and then when you're done casting your stuff, maybe you hold up a counter spell when you're like getting in combat or something, but you don't want a lot of that. And so the answer to how many am I supposed to play is, well, it depends on how good they are in your deck. So I don't have a number for you. So that was a lot of words to not answer your question, but also I hope it answered a question that might have been more useful. Next up, how cute is Ghost Kitty? Very. Next up, how many specimens is too many? I had a good blue-black deck with 9 exploit, 3 specimens, 2 dissenter as the main fodder. I guess I can imagine 3 being right in that spot. 9 is a ton of exploit. You do really want to have one. In general, I think I would prefer to try to stick to 2. Like, I would much rather have 3 dissenter, 2 specimen than 3 specimen, 2 dissenter. But, if you're just like, hey, was I stupid for playing the 3rd specimen here? I could believe that the 3rd specimen was right in that particular deck, but it sounds pretty exceptional. Should exploit blue-black have a high or low curve? How many creatures should usually be in blue-black exploit? Really depends on what exploit stuff you're seeing. The blue-black exploit deck that I had that I thought was best was like low curve, very aggressive with multiple skull scabs and really cheap fodder. And I, made like 10 zombies on turn 3 or something. It was completely absurd. I guess I mean turn 4 probably. You can also play... I played against a really cool exploit deck that was using Repository Scab with like Alchemist Retrieval and the rare 3/3 flying counter exploit thing, and it had Witness the Future, and it just like got into these like crazy loops of like getting back counter spells and using Blood Fountain to get back its exploit stuff, and took a game that I thought I was really far ahead and just like crawled its way back through generating all this like value over a really long game. And that deck has a really, really different curve than the like aggro exploit deck that I had. So not all exploit decks are created equally, and it's really just going to depend on the exact details of your deck. What are my opinions on the data shown so far? For example, it rates Witness the Future very low, but mentioned seeing it perform well. Actually, what I mentioned was seeing that its win rate is good in blue-black specifically. It had a 58% win rate in blue-black. I didn't look at its win rate overall. I just saw that it, in a pretty small sample size, had success there, which makes me think that maybe I should try it out. My personal experience with Witness has been low because I've been too skeptical to try it, and it was precisely the data that has me interested in giving it a chance. Next up, is it worth heavily investing / focusing on trying to get the 3-card infinite zombie combo? Wow, there's an infinite zombie combo. That's pretty cool. I wonder if it uses a rare. I haven't read all of those. I don't know. I guess it depends on how good these 3 cards are. This is news to me, so I guess I can't answer the question. Next up, is it worth it to splash a good card when you're solid on blue-black? I think I already touched on this. I will generally be trying to avoid splashing. And then this is another question that was probably asked before I went deeply into it. Is splashing easier with blood? Not as much easier as you would hope. Blood is nowhere near as good as splashing as treasures, for example. Am I correct in assuming that most or all of your blue-black decks have been playing small games? Is there a danger in playing a small game that might be longer if you don't have any bonds? I would say that the exploit stuff isn't actually always playing small games, and neither is the flying stuff. So playing a small game with the blue-black would imply like heavily prioritizing removal and kind of playing more of the value game, which is what I see as possible with the like control approach. But I would say that actually my experience personally with blue black has been appreciably more tempo oriented, where I'm, like playing Cruel Witness and jumping with Doom Dissenter and, playing like Diregraph Scavenger to drain my opponent and hold the fort while I attack with like flyers. And I've been like going wide with zombies due to just like really going off with Skull Scab. Oh, random note that this is totally off topic from this question, but a mistake that I made, and then I saw an opponent make the same mistake, so I want to talk about Skull Scab, the blue-black uncommon 2/2 exploit. When you exploit a non-token creature, make a 2/2 zombie. That card, like that, when you sacrifice that, you get a 2/2 zombie. So it's basically the same thing as Doom Dissenter, but like with a better front side. And so I had a game where I played that and then played Stitched Assistant and sacrificed my 2/2 because it's like, oh, well, this is basically a Doom Dissenter. So I'll sacrifice it to my assistant and I'll get a zombie and I'll get my like op from my Stitched Assistant. What I should have done is I should have sacrificed the Stitched Assistant to itself. I still get the 2/2, but I get to keep my 2/2 that makes 2/2s when I sack things, rather than keeping my 3/2 that doesn't make 2/2s when I sack things, because I had other exploit cards in my deck. And so it's worth giving up 1 power right now for another zombie the next time I do this. And then I played against another blue-black deck that did the same thing. Sacrificed their 2/2 to their 3/2 instead of sacking the 3/2 to itself. But just wanted to, a note on playing this deck, which I usually don't get into, is if you have that Skull Scab as a thing that pays you for exploiting a bunch and you have other exploit stuff, don't throw away your Skull Scab. You can just sack creatures to themselves. And then you can, do stuff like get those creatures back with like the bat or the fountain and then do it again. That's good. Anyway, as far as big games versus small games, so that guy who's making zombies when I sack stuff, that leads to big games. So it's cool if you have removal, but I guess often instead of having a bunch of bleed dries, I end up with like Chill the Graves and the uncommon bounce spell that draws a card, and play those lead to longer games, bigger games, because they give me more cards and don't get rid of a thing, and just like that thing is not currently trading with anything because it's locked up. It's just leading to a bigger game. So no, I guess I would say you're not correct in assuming that I've been doing small games with this deck specifically, or this archetype. Next up is an interesting question that I don't have a great answer to. Is there a specific color pie, I assume color pair, counters the blue-black exploit strategy? This is like a pretty interesting question for me about limited in general. Like, which pair, like what archetype is good against what other archetype? And it's not like, it's a really useful question to think about in sealed, where you might have a lot of different ways that you can build your deck and different archetypes you can play. And you play against someone and you discover which archetype they are. And if you know which archetype is good against them, you can become that archetype to beat them. Whereas, most of the time in draft, if you know which archetype is good against another archetype, that doesn't do anything for you, because by the time you're actually playing against someone, you can't change what archetype you are. And because I almost exclusively play draft rather than sealed, it's not something that I've had an incentive to like really study or learn about. But then every time, whenever I do play a lot of sealed, I'm like, oh, wow, it would be cool to know this. So the answer is, if you're a sealed player, I think it's a really interesting question, but unfortunately not one I have an answer to. You mentioned exploit is not so heavy, so worth even going with the archetype. My experience has been that I have been able to get decks that have like deep exploit synergies and that has played well. So I guess, yes, I do think there's enough of it. I was just saying that if you're fighting with someone else, you are likely going to struggle. But that's just a matter of, being prepared to navigate the draft and figuring out what you can and can't do in a particular draft. And so that's similar to like when I was, for those who listened and remember, when I talked about green, white, and midnight hunt, I mentioned that was like a very uncommon based archetype and that it would struggle if someone else at the table is looking for the same uncommons. Similar situation here. The exploit decks, the uncommons for the exploit deck are so much better than the commons that it's an uncommon based space to go in, which means that it's going to struggle if you're fighting with someone. But those uncommons are so good that you'll be heavily rewarded if you can take advantage of them. And because they do require this specific setup to take advantage of, if that lane is open, you'll be rewarded for being able to utilize it. So that means that, yes, sometimes when you see those cards, it's going to be worth doing because the payoff is high. It's often said that counterspells pair well with instants and creatures with flash. What other types of cards pair well with counterspells? Cheap creatures. Instants, creatures with flash, and cheap creatures. Also, just cheap cards. Cheap removal, cheap creatures, instants. That's the list. I guess also bombs that catch you up for not having done anything while you were holding up sweepers, or holding up mana, which is to say sweepers. So cheap creatures and sweepers, though ideally not together, are the other things that pair well with counterspells. How hard can you lean in the control direction? Is it worth trying to lean as hard as you can, given how important dealing with bombs is? So, problem with leaning super hard into the control direction, where you're like, oh, I need to deal with bombs, so I'm going to prioritize removal, and then I'll be able to deal with bombs. Well, two issues. One, everyone else also wants those removal spells, so you might just not see enough. And if you have drafted a slow deck that doesn't have as much removal as you were hoping for, you will give your opponent time to cast a bomb that you can't deal with, and you will lose. Also, other people who did not get as much removal as they wanted and didn't get bombs will be incentivized to go as fast as possible. And if you filled your deck with 4 and 6 mana removal spells, you will lose to the players who fill their deck with 2 and 3 mana creatures. So it's not that easy. Curve is also a good question. I've been going lower and lower and limited over the last 2 years. Is it get on board fast but still be grindy? Yes. If I understand your question correctly, yes, I think that this is still a format that wants a low curve. I think that we see that very, very clearly with things like Lantern Bearer